Array.prototype.map is one of the essential JavaScript functions that every self-respecting developer should know. The basics of the function are pretty straightforward, but there is a lot more to it than most of us think. Don't worry, everything will be clear after you finished watching. Map can be called on any array. It takes a function as its parameter and it creates a new array populated by the results of calling the given function on each element of the initial array. In this example, the function takes an element and multiplies it by 2. So the result will be a new array with the same length as the original one, just each of the elements will be doubled. Now let's take a look at some actual code. Let's call the function that we give to map as a parameter the callback function. The callback function is map's only mandatory parameter. Plus, it has one optional second parameter that we will talk about in just a second. As map iterates over the initial array, it will call the callback function on each iteration exactly with 3 parameters. Element is the actual element that we are currently iterating over. In this case, this will be the string 1, 2, and so on. Index, the index of the current iteration starting from 0. Array, the initial array that we called map on. In this case, it will be this whole array. This third parameter should never change if you are using map correctly. The best part about map is that it doesn't change the initial array, which means that map doesn't mutate data, so it usually doesn't cause hard to debug problems. Technically, you could make map change the initial array, but it's an anti-pattern, so don't do it please. Now let's get back to the optional second parameter. It will dictate what this will be in the callback function. The default value of this is undefined, but if we define the second parameter, we get access to it by the this keyword. You can pass down a function or an object or anything that you would like to access in the callback function. Let's see this in action. We will create a function called capitalize which takes a string and converts its first letter to uppercase. And pass it to map as its second parameter. Now we can call this function in our callback function and capitalize each string in the initial array. And disclaimer, this wasn't a practical example, but I'm sure you will be able to find many use cases for this. Speaking of practical examples, let's go over 3 actual use cases that JavaScript developers encounter on the daily. Here we have an array of names and we would like to remove all of the unnecessary whitespace from these names. Let's use map to iterate over each of the elements and call the trim function on them. If you didn't know, trim will do exactly what we want and it will remove the whitespace. The only thing we did was that we made sure that trim will be called on each of the names. This is the most straightforward use case of map. We have an array of any elements and we want to execute a function on each of them. On to the second use case. We have an array of objects and we want to add an ID field to each of them. We can use map to iterate over the objects, spread them out with the spread syntax and add an ID field to them. This could be the index because it's going to be unique for each iteration. Also, let's say a year has passed, so we want to make everyone a year older. In this case, we can use the destructuring assignment to get the name and the age in a nice way. As you can see, it's really practical to use map to change an array of objects and add or take values from them. If you wanna get into web development, the third example is definitely for you. It's very common that a web developer needs to create repetitive HTML code like a list from an array of objects. In this example, we have an array of users and we want to display each of them in a list. We have an empty unordered list tag. This is where the list items are going to go. Let's take each of the users, extract their name and wrap it in a list HTML tag with map. After that, we can just make the inner HTML of the unordered list tag equal to the result of our map. Don't forget to use join because we want a string that's in the list, not the actual list. Map is very useful when you are working with HTML, or if you want to learn React, for example, you will have to use map in a similar way. There are a number of things to consider when using map. Map will be called on every existing element in an array. Existing means any value that has been assigned, including undefined or null. But this doesn't include elements that have never been set or have been deleted. Also, make sure that you always return a value in the callback function. If If you don't return anything at a given index, map will set a default value of undefined there, because when you use map, the resulting array will have the same length as the initial one. If you want to exclude some element from the initial array, you will have to use filter instead. The next thing that you should always consider is that map will always call the callback function with exactly 3 parameters. This can cause super abstract, hard to debug problems. Let me show you an example. Let's say we have an array of numbers that are for some reason in a string format. We want to turn them into integers. Thankfully, in JavaScript, there is this built-in function called Parseint, which will do exactly that. This looks a lot like the first straightforward use case that we discussed earlier, where we have an array of elements and we want to call a function on each of them. So let's do it. We will now expect an output that looks something like this. But what we actually get is this. So what's happening here? Well, if we look up the documentation of parseint, we can see that it has an optional second parameter called radix, which is the base of the number that we want a string to be converted to. So map will call parseint with the element and the index of the current iteration. If we call parseint on each of the elements separately with the same parameters, we get the same output. So we can see that map and parseint did exactly what they promised. The problem was with our implementation. We just need to wrap parseint in a function and call it with exactly one parameter. This is a great practice if you are using any built-in function with map. Now onto the more advanced stuff. Unfortunately, map by default doesn't work on objects. But this doesn't mean we can't make it work somehow. We can use the object.entries method on our object, which will return an array of key value pairs just like this. This is already a value that we can use map on. Now at each iteration, the element will be an array which we can destructure into a key and a value. After we did our thing, we can use object.fromEntries. This method will do the exact opposite of object.entries and will convert our array of key value pairs back to an object. With a bit of creativity and logic, we can use map on our objects now. But when it comes to code, the simpler a solution the better. And this looks kinda intimidating, just to be honest. We can use lodash, for example, which has a perfect function for our needs. Map values will work just like our normal map would, but we can use it on our objects. It will preserve the keys as they are, we just have to worry about the values. This looks much better than the first solution. The only problem is that we can't customize the keys, so if you would want to do that for some reason, just use the first solution. So now we know how to map over objects, but what about strings, for example? Well, again, by default we can't use map on a string. But again, this won't keep us down because there is a function called array.from, which will turn any array-like objects into an array. By array-like, I mean objects that have length and can be indexed, like sets, maps, strings, and node lists. So this solution won't just work on strings, but on all of the above. So let's see this in action. We have a string here, let's call array.from on it. The result is as expected, an array containing each of the characters in order. Technically we are done, we can use map on this. But what if we want the result to also be a string? Well, we can just use the join function. Don't forget to pass an empty string as parameter, because the default is a comma. But if you look at the documentation of array.from, we can see that calling map separately is not necessary, because array.from takes an optional second parameter called map function. We can just take our function and pass it directly to array.from. As said earlier, this will work on node lists as well, so keep this in mind if you want to become a web developer. In the last section of this video, I think it will be a great practice if we will try to create our own map function. So what do we need to accomplish? The function can only be called on arrays directly. It takes 2 parameters, the callback function and the optional second one. It calls the callback function with 3 parameters, the element, the index, and the initial array. And the value of this inside the callback function needs to be the optional second parameter. Plus, it can't mutate the initial array, and of course, it needs to do the create a new array by calling the callback function on each element, so on and so forth thing. So let's get started. We can define our own function as array.prototype.map2. This is going to equal a function which takes 2 parameters, a function and the optional second parameter. Now let's see what we have so far. Let's call map2 on this array. And let's console.log the two parameters plus the value of this. As you can see, this is going to be the initial array. Disclaimer, this will get confusing. There will be a different this inside the map2 function and the callback function, so don't get scared. Speaking of this, we will need to set the value of this in the callback function equal to the second parameter. If you look at the documentation, we can see there is a function called call, which does exactly that. So let's do it. I will console.log the result just so we can see. Now that we made this work, we have to create a loop. I will go with a straightforward for loop. Inside the loop, I will use the call function and I have to pass 3 parameters to this function. The element, which will be the ith element of this. The index is I and the initial array is this. Again, these thises that are here are inside the map2 function, and the this arg is going to be the this inside the callback function. Now let's console.log everything out to make sure everything works. And as you can see, it does. But we still need to do the actual thing that map does. So I will create an empty array, and at each iteration I will push the result of calling the function with all of these parameters to the array. And I will return the result. Now let's test this out. And as you can see, it works perfectly, the initial array is not changed. And this just works exactly how the normal map function would. So congratulations to us, I think we did a great job with this. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you learned a lot. Make sure to press the like button and subscribe so you can keep improving your JavaScript skills. See you next time.